Alright, so for the next one of these where we're putting up an original movie against its remake, we're going to look at the Flatliners from 1990, the original, and the 2017 remake. Which, the remake of this is one of those movies that just kind of immediately got shit for existing because not only is the first one so good, but it also just kind of had such an original concept in itself. And when you hear the characters talk about why they're doing this, like the whole purpose of it is that it's exploring this sort of untapped area and sees death itself as an untapped area. And so they're using the science and what they know medically, and they're basically going in and trying to experience death and then come back out of it in order to sort of just see what happens and the way, and obviously record it. There's potentially, fame involved with 60 Minutes continuously getting brought up, but for the most part, it's really just because we want to know. And it's this thing that basically we all just kind of have a really crippling fear of it and the unknown nature of it, what happens after, if anything, and stuff like that. And so, for a movie to explore it in the ingenious way that the original Flatliners does, it is a particular case of what can you really do with a remake, because there's so many directions that the story and the writing go into with Flatliners also, and directions that the characters go. What exactly can you do to not make it just feel like it's the same movie? Because the concept in itself is a little redundant. The original movie finds a way around this because the writing is so good and they use the concept so well. But it's, when you think about the fact that there's four characters that do this, and they all have four different experiences, and they all come to this sort of karmic conclusion of what's happening supernaturally to them afterwards, and you see it happen to one, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then the solution, one, then the other, and the other, and the other. It's already a redundant concept that's handled well. So to bring us over to a remake where we're going to essentially see that concept again, we've already handled the redundancy well with this one, where it did different things, but here, it might be harder to get around that. It especially might be harder to get around that because there was a movie, not a great movie, but one that does exist. It was 2 years before this, in 2015, I think. It was The Lazarus Effect with Olivia Wilde and Mark Duplass and Donald Glover, that kind of tried to delve in this territory in its own way also. I kind of feel like, even though it's not the exact same thing as Flatliners exactly, it does feel like it's close enough that it renders a Flatliners remake 2 years later pretty pointless. So there's a lot of things coming in against the 2017 movie, but maybe we can find some good in it as we go. But to talk about, I guess I want to start with the characters and the cast, ultimately, which is, starting with the first movie, the original movie. I do like how we start with Kevin Bacon, and there's a sort of, I don't know if you want to call it irony exactly, but the opening scene is him getting reprimanded for essentially saving a life. He does something very reckless in order to do that, but he does ultimately save a life. And the fact that what they have to do in the movie now as it goes on with the concept is bring people back to life in a very different way, under very different circumstances, in a very different context. And the idea of having to take the life first. So for the movie to begin with not just saving a life but getting reprimanded for it is something I always found really interesting, as far as seeing where these characters are coming from and what they're ultimately going to have to do, especially due to each other. And you have these different personalities coming in. You've got Kiefer Sutherland's Nelson, who is basically our main character, and is the one whose whole idea this is, and the one that puts all of this together, and ultimately kind of gets power hungry over it. And then you've got Julia Roberts, who has this really sort of close connection with death through her patients, and she also has death in her past, that's going to come into her story a lot. And then there's Billy Baldwin, I guess. If there's one character that I feel like could probably be written out of this movie, and it's not that Billy Baldwin's bad in this or anything, it's just when you look at what I was talking about, where when we go through each character, and each character has a similar path, But the ingenious thing they did with the writing of the characters and what happens to them after the fact is that they do go in different directions. And Baldwin's character especially has a very different haunt than everybody else in a way that I don't know. It just kind of really sticks out in this really weird way. So I do feel like you could eliminate Billy Baldwin from this movie and not a lot would change. And it might be able to kind of, maybe the pacing could be just a little bit better. Um, but still seeing the dynamic between all of them and seeing these moments we get, these really dark moments where when they all kind of start getting hungry for it and they all start getting hungry for the experience and the knowledge of what comes with it, they start basically bidding for a place to do this, where they start bidding on, well, if I do it for this amount of time, and then if I do it for longer, then I have more of a reason and a purpose to do this. To the point that it's going to eventually start getting dangerous, and it feels redundant to kind of say life-threatening, because it's already that anyway. That's the whole point, is that it's life-threatening, but there's a possibility they might not come back if they do it for too long, and that's where this one of the aspects of suspense that comes in. This is another thing that's great about the original movie, is the different places it's able to find suspense and bring them into the story and work them in sort of logically within the movie's reasoning. So looking at that from that perspective, and also the idea that we do throw a love triangle into this, but it doesn't really feel like a traditional one. It doesn't feel like one that takes away from the story the way a love triangle typically would, where it's kind of going on between Kiefer Sutherland's character, Kevin Bacon's character, and Julia Roberts. And the idea of there's this sort of vindictiveness to Nelson that makes this really interesting. Like I said, doesn't make it feel like this traditional love triangle. If anything, there's something almost sadistic about the love triangle and the sort of rivalry that they have, especially for her. And it does something to the stakes as far as what's going on here, where if this whole operation were to sort of crash and burn because of emotions getting involved or people getting vindictive towards each other, that could get really, really bad or really fast. Um, Now, establishing the character dynamics there, going into the remake, where we start with Courtney, it's worth noting really quick that Elliot Page plays Courtney, but since Courtney is a female character, I just don't want there to be any confusion when I refer to Courtney as she, which I'm going to do. So Courtney's kind of in the Nelson place, where she's the one that basically gets the idea and kind of brings everybody into it. And she's also coming from this very sort of dark past, and there's been death in her life previously. So kind of combining some character traits here, but also kind of coming from its own place also, but it's still feeling very familiar nonetheless. And then we've got different characters like Diego Luna, who's kind of doing what Oliver Platt does in the original movie, where he's not the one that goes in, he's the one that's kind of not sure about it, but he's always there to observe, and he's kind of got this sort of superior position. And Diego Luna is able to play that to where he seems to effortlessly kind of know everything, and does that believably enough. We've got Kiersey Clemens, who's kind of under the recognizable student pressure, where just everything is weighing down on her, like exams and everything are weighing down on her. And it's all starting to feel overwhelming as she's getting closer to what's going on here. And then we've got Jamie, who's basically the trust fund kid, and we've got Nina Dobrev, who's also the sort of guilt-ridden one. We do the guilt-ridden thing a few times here, where it may feel a bit more repetitive than it does in the original movie, because we do have moments in the original movie where, like, you know, when we're dealing with what exactly their pasts are, and it might seem repetitive that Kiefer Sutherland and Kevin Bacon are kind of coming from the same place of having been bullies in their childhood, but the ingenious thing that the writing does is, obviously, Kevin Bacon's victim is still alive, and as we learn much later, Kiefer Sutherland's bullying victim is not, and was killed in an incident while that was happening. And so to kind of take something that feels like it's going to be the same thing, but then revelations show us that they're coming from two completely different places, as far as the karmic angle coming in and what they're going to have to do to hopefully stop these supernatural occurrences that could seemingly be deadly to them. There's definitely much more of an emotional impact, it feels like, when it comes to these characters. because we were talking about like the love triangle in there, but how they use that in a sort of different way. Um, Flatliners is a first of all it's a PG-13 version, so you're essentially getting a PG-13 movie, which means we're going to be focusing on characters that seem younger, and also the big emotional points are basically going to be who's going to bang who, and we focus a lot more on that than we do in this. Like I said, with this one, it's there's the whole thing going on with Billy Baldwin's character, as far as like sexual material in the movie and all that. But the love triangle kind of feels much more like it's really the part of that story is really pushed by Nelson's vindictiveness and what that's going to amount to. And like I said, here we are just kind of getting the same old shit that you would expect from something like that. The obstacle that the original movie was able to avoid, this one just kind of falls right into as far as characters and how they connect. And it puts a lot of focus on that. So that's really unfortunate. But to talk about the scenes, the big sort of money scenes of the movie are going to be when every character has their first flatline. So the way the original movie handles that, where it's a little off-putting at first, when we see Nelson go under, because it is kind of getting things from a lot of different angles where, we're in the room and we're also looking through the sort of black and white camera, and so we see that footage, and we're also seeing what Nelson is seeing, and it's cutting a lot back and forth between this. It almost looks like a 90s music video or something, or a late 80s music video or something, as far as the way it's cut. But once it's showing us what Nelson is seeing and it sticks with it, it does really capture the sort of euphoria that's coming with it, and we kind of see that with the different characters, where with Nelson it's almost like this sort of nostalgic vibe. With Kevin Bacon it's like, flying over mountains. Obviously Billy Baldwin's is going to be more like erotic based. Roberts kind of immediately goes to what the sort of punchline is here, which is eventually all these things are going to turn really bad and really dark. And in Roberts' case, it does pretty much start with the bad memories in her life and all of this kind of coming out, and the guilt coming out. Especially since there was the whole moment where she's talking to her older patient who's about to die, and she's basically saying, oh, it's going to be really beautiful, you're going to a much better and more beautiful place. And then she's overrun with guilt when she realizes that that's not the case, at least from what she's seen. So it's really using these to build the character, but also kind of take the audience to this place. Like I said, in this place where we're kind of seeing death from like a first-person perspective, which is really wild. And the way like they use the feel of like dreams blending into reality, and the way they do that. And so there's like some moments after the flatlines that are set in reality, but they still kind of feel dreamlike in a way. Like, I love just in general, I think it's the night Bacon flatlines. It takes place on Halloween, and so there's like this really sort of Halloween atmosphere going on, and it feels like this sort of bizarre building to a nightmare or something. But also like pure Halloween imagery, which I just love. But then we've also got moments like, just fleeting moments, like when Nelson's standing in the street and that swarm of bikes comes by, and these moments where you're just not quite sure if a character is like dreaming or having a vision, or if it's what they're actually seeing. So, which makes it all the more effective when these supernatural forces kind of start coming in, like the visions of who they bullied start to come in and terrorize them. And in cases like Nelson's case, like actually physically attacking them, successfully physically attacking them, from whatever realm they might be coming from, if that's even what's going on. I kind of like that the movie's a bit vague as far as where the supernatural aspect is coming from. But I think the less that's explained, actually, I think the movie's better off for it. And how you just kind of accept that there's some kind of supernatural reaction that's being had to flatlining, and the past literally coming back to hurt them. As far as the remake goes, with the flatline scenes, they're not bad. It's like when we see Courtney go under first, and we see the moments where she's just sort of flying over like the city, where that moment where she sees the roof of the hospital and she says like, I've never even been up there, but I definitely saw it. And it gives you that vibe of experiencing something in a way you never could in life, like in actual life. And it's not bad as far as how it handles that. I also like with Jamie, when Jamie flatlines, we don't see the process of him doing it, which does kind of cut out a bit of that redundancy we were talking about. But the way it transitions from Courtney experiencing horror after the fact and being kind of terrorized after the fact, and then it transitions into what Jamie's seeing as he's flatlining. And I like that transition, not only because it's just kind of a smooth transition, but also the way it blends the sort of the horror that they have in response to this and the euphoria that they have in response to this, and kind of seeing the differences back to back right there was surprisingly well done. And then the idea of, like, once they've done it, this concept they've thrown into the remake of it, like, unlocking everything you've ever learned. And the idea that we're looking at it from the perspective of, like, you know, like students, like people who are still in school, like Kiersey Clemens' character who's feels bombarded, and just, like, the one thing that you want to know when you're in that position as a student is, okay, can I just know everything I've ever known, and it just stays there, and I just automatically know it, and I don't have to remember it or dig for it, or it's not something that's forgotten. And the idea that it basically becomes this dream scenario for a student, and that would be, and it's like, so it's even more appealing to them to want to do it. I don't remember if we get something as dark as when they're like bidding for time in the original movie, but I like the fact that even though we know the dark angle that it takes, the fact that it does make the idea of flatlining more appealing to them in that aspect, and gives them more of a reason in, like, their personal lives to do it in order to make themselves more successful, not just for basically discovering the concept of flatlining itself, but for the aftermath also being beneficial to them, is a pretty decent tweak on the concept. But yeah, talking about the concept, as we've talked about, there is going to start being that horror angle that comes in when the karmic part starts to come in, where they have to kind of make amends for their past and all that. And the way it starts to genre bend when it does this, and I definitely feel like the original movie does this much more successfully, because there's a lot to balance here, where it's like it starts off as like sci-fi and maybe there's a little bit of thriller, and then this sci-fi thriller kind of progresses into horror gradually as it goes. And then ultimately, once the horror has been had and everybody's been terrorized and they realize what's terrorizing them and what they can do about it, just like that, seamlessly, it becomes like a poignant drama as it ends and as they get to their conclusions. And so, to make that transition, that's a lot of genres to go through. Sci-fi, then thriller, then horror, ending at poignant drama. And that had to have been really difficult in the writing process, to be able to get to that point gradually in a way where it actually hits emotionally. And to me, the movie pulls it off for the most part. There's cases here like Billy Baldwin's character basically comes off as a sociopath, and it's like we don't really, and like I said, his haunt is just so different anyway. It just kind of feels misplaced, and it doesn't really feel like this is a guy that really, it doesn't really matter to you emotionally as the viewer, if he, you know, learns the error of his ways or whatever, or gets karmic justice, whatever it might be. The sociopathy of the character makes him feel almost insignificant when it comes to the idea of seeing the characters get redemption. Because he's kind of the only one that seems to be coming from an immoral place, because what Sutherland and Bacon did, they did as children, and the stuff that Billy Baldwin's doing that he needs to atone for, he's doing now, like as an adult. So, like I said, it just really sticks out in this weird way. But when you look at the others, it does seem like it struggles a little bit when it starts to become a horror movie, like when Billy Mahoney starts attacking Nelson. And so we get moments where we watch Kiefer Sutherland getting kicked in the balls and being bullied by a child when he is adult Kiefer Sutherland. And I can understand where it might be hard to take those scenes seriously at first, before we know what's going on. When you do know what's going on, I feel like it works, and it does, like, once you understand that it's, his past coming back for him and his bullying him from beyond the grave after the death that he unintentionally caused. There's definitely something much more poignant and scary about that when but like I said, and him, like, spitting on him being this big dramatic thing, the way they play it up so dramatically of him getting kicked in the balls or spit on or whatever, I can get where that could be tough to, take seriously and be, scared by or whatever. But like I said, it's all in knowing what the sort of outcome is and what the purpose of all this is, why this is happening, and the fact that there is an emotional punch to it eventually. Um, but there's also moments where they manage to throw in some comedic moments. Like, Oliver Platt has a lot of comedic lines. He feels like more of the comedy relief than anything else in it. And then there's, like, these scenes that don't even really ask for comedy, but you realize in the moment how serious we've gotten by this point because it's late in the movie. So it's actually kind of, we're happy to see just a little comedic beat here and there. So there's that moment when Kevin Bacon meets up with Winnie again, and he kind of reintroduces himself, and Nelson is watching this from afar and, like, narrating. And it's like, it's almost out of place, but like I said, the movie's gotten so serious up to this point, we probably needed just this little comedic beat from Nelson. And then the fact that not only do we have that comedic beat, but there's this really, great moment, this big emotional, touching moment, where Winnie is clearly trying to play off that she doesn't remember who Kevin Bacon is, and so he's just kind of apologizing. He's telling the whole story, and she's kind of put off by it. And then just as he's leaving, she stops him and says thank you, and it's like, okay, she knew who he was the whole time. Like, as soon as at least as soon as he introduced himself, it may have been on site. She knew who he was and remembered what he'd done and what her life on the playground was like because of him. And so that moment where it's like she does thank him for doing it and he thanks her back is this really great moment. Now, this is where you would think we'd get some tonal whiplash, where once Bacon goes back outside to the car where Nelson is under attack from Billy Mahoney at this point, and we're cutting back and forth between we got this nice point of view shot of Billy Mahoney as he's kind of stalking around the truck, and we're cutting back and forth between that and the Bacon and Winnie scene. And there is something. What I think is interesting about this scene is that it's a horror scene set during the day, because a lot of this movie is in the dark, and pretty much all of the horror scenes in the remake are in the dark. And the dark is where you expect to have a horror scene. So to see Nelson sitting here where you think he'd be safe in broad daylight in a car, and that he kind of gets terrorized at the sort of least expected moment, kind of gives the tonal whiplash of the scene a bit of a purpose, I feel like. Because, like, the point of it is that's kind of like at the worst possible time is when Billy Mahoney strikes in this moment. I also love the idea of Kiefer Sutherland being stalked by a small figure in a red hood, as his father was in Don't Look Now, very, very famously. So I don't know if that's intentional, but I feel like it kind of has to be, at least to an extent. Surely Joel Schumacher was a Don't Look Now fan, because I would imagine most directors are. So, like I said, when we get to these moments where we can combine horror and poignancy and thriller and all that, and how the movie kind of miraculously is able to balance them, especially when we get the reveals with Julia Roberts' character and her arc with her dad, and seeing those, like, that whole arc from the perspective of her visions, how they basically tell a whole other story about her and where she sort of comes from, and this emotional driving force for her is just really, really well done in a way that, like, I can't imagine could have been easy to write or put together as successfully as this. Maybe the editing's playing a part also, but yeah, I feel like the movie's kind of ingenious with the directions it's able to take and the emotional impact that it can have at the end of the day. Also helped a lot by, this movie has a pretty amazing score that I don't feel like it gets enough credit for. So I think it's a James Newton Howard score too, so that really shouldn't be surprising. And like I said, the way it transitions from its genres seamlessly and back and forth, and then ultimately being able to have this big thrilling climax that is driven by an emotional factor and ends on an emotional factor. It's really, really well done. Now, as far as the remake and how it's going to sort of up the stakes here, because we've already. First of all, when the karmic stuff starts to come in, it is interesting that there's a sort of mystery angle to the original movie that this one's lacking, especially in Courtney's case, because we already know what's gonna be haunting Courtney because it's the opening scene where she wrecks the car with her sister and her sister has apparently died. So there's nothing to figure out there, and she's basically played up as the main character. But then the remake did something really interesting. Where I was talking about you could have cut out Billy Baldwin for time and because his character is just what his character is. So the people who made the remake decided, okay, we can lose a character. Let's kill a character. Which surprisingly is something the original movie didn't do to raise the stakes. And I think that's part of the talent that was behind the original movie too, is that they were able to make the stakes feel really high and give it a really big emotional impact without killing a main character. So here, the movie just really gives us a gut punch where, with a good chunk of the movie left, like an entire act of the movie left, they kill Courtney off, who was essentially our main character, and I don't know how I feel about this for a number of reasons. I like the balls when it comes to doing that. And the idea that it does sort of raise the stakes. But it does. There's no closure for the character. I mean, they try to do it at the end, but it doesn't really hit. Especially and it feels like a very throwaway way to kind of try to give the character closure and bring the character back a little bit, given the fact that they killed the main character with like 45 minutes of the movie left, and certainly the biggest actor in it at the time, I would think. But the idea, Diego Luna's big in his, sort of circles, like people who, know like E.T. Mom Tom and stuff like that. But Elliot Page at this time, I would, like, there's a reason that he was the one that's, like, first credited on the poster, etc. And yeah, and then to kill Courtney with 45 minutes left. The thing that also kind of bugs me is that when I talk about, there still being closure with the sister, is that there were disposable characters here. You could have killed Nina Dobrev, you could have killed Jamie, and it would have been, and nobody would have really missed those characters, I don't think. So, but as far as that goes, though, when you talk about the horror aspect coming in, and the way we see Courtney terrorized by the visions of her sister, these are pretty creepy scenes. For a movie that's not that great and is a much lesser version of another movie, these scenes are pretty effectively creepy, and there's another scene in this that really, really works well and is genuinely creepy and scary, even though they fuck it up at the very last minute. And still, I want to give the scene credit. It's the baby blanket scare, where I think it's Jamie, and we see a figure underneath a baby blanket, and it's like breathing, and he slowly, slowly, slowly pulls the blanket off, and then there's just nothing under there. It's a really good, well done scene, and a really well done sort of creepy scare moment. And then they do the bullshit of the jump scare over his shoulder thing and fuck it up. But, like I said, even though they fucked it up, I still want to give credit to how well the baby blanket scene is done. A very effective moment, horror-wise. But other than that, there's not really much going on. And when we get to, the angle of them sort of atoning, and because we got Kiersey Clemons with the girl whose nudes she circulated, and it's that thing also where it's like you get the bullying angle that we got before, and it's like it's the stuff that we've seen before. And when you talk about there being an emotional impact, like there's an emotional impact of Courtney dying, and there's enough of an emotional impact, I guess, with Kiersey Clemons having her scene like Kevin Bacon with Winnie and apologizing and confessing and doing all that. As far as the other characters, like I said, Jamie is I keep forgetting that character's in the movie, honestly, with the exception of the baby blanket scene. That's about the as much worth as Jamie had, at least to me in this. So, as far as getting emotional impact, that leaves Nina Dobrev's character, who let a patient die, and it's and basically like directly caused the death of a patient, and so and lied about it and covered it up. And so this is about as bad as it gets. So you would think the atonement would be the big emotional impact that it comes to, like we saw with the other characters, atoning for their sins of the past and making right for the people that they wronged. Um, and they get enough of, like, you would say what happens to them throughout the movie is basically their consequences. So when you look at the Nina Dobrev character and the horrible, terrible thing that she did, and keep in mind, I say this again, Nelson caused a death as well. But Nelson was a child, and it was a totally inadvertent thing. There wasn't, like, an intent to kill Billy Mahoney. What he was doing was terrible bullying. He was also a child that didn't know better. So, Nina Dobrev is an adult. She is a medical student. And to basically better her own way, she covered up this death that she caused. So, whatever karma is going to come down on her is going to be huge and really impactful to this character, right? Um, she gets probation. And so I don't know why they thought this character deserved a happy ending. I don't know why they thought we would want this character to have a happy ending, because we don't really give a fuck about her anyway. Like I said, a lot of it was just, is she going to bang Diego Luna or is she not? And that's about it. That's as much as they want to do with the character, except for her getting haunted by this guy that she essentially killed. And so for doing that and covering it up, oh good, I just got probation. Um, I don't know if that's karma. I don't know that that's justice. In fact, I can tell you it's fucking not. So, that is incredibly unsatisfying, and I can't believe that they were big enough pussies to not give her maximum karma after they literally killed Courtney, the main character. That's, you want to talk whiplash. There's not much whiplash in what I was talking about of, oh, it goes from comedic to poignant to horror. No, that's not whiplash at all. They managed to make that not feel like it came from out of nowhere. This, to kill Courtney and give Nina Dobrev probation for what she did, that's fucking whiplash. That is, where did this come from? These are two totally different outcomes. I don't know. That does not sit right at well. Actually, that's so shitty. I feel like that in itself, by itself, affects the movie immensely. Because, like I said, the movie's not great, but it's well made, and it's got a few talented people in it, and it's and it's got some really decent scares in it, and some really genuinely creepy moments in it. And like I said, when it does the flatlining, and it kind of shows that euphoric nature of being in this place you could never be in life, it does that pretty well. But then there are moments here like this that are just baffling, and so, yeah, and like I said, and having the balls to kill the main character, that's something that I can give it credit for, but it just seems like every time it has a good thing, it finds a way to fuck it up. The scene I was talking about with the baby blanket where they fucked it up with the scare over the shoulder is kind of the whole sort of symbolism for the entire movie and how it turned out. But I hate that part of the ending. I don't hate the movie, actually. And I don't, yeah, maybe it was, I don't know if it was trying too hard or if I admire it. I go both ways on actually getting Kiefer Sutherland in the movie to play the Doctor, but it could, and I guess I like that they held back on not actually making him Nelson. But then I started asking myself, was there a point? Why don't you just make him Nelson? But then you'd have to make this movie canon, and then that'd be a whole other thing. So it's I don't know, but that's so I have mixed feelings about the remake, we'll say, but I got really strongly positive feelings about the original movie, which is really fucking great actually. So I think that's what I can say about these. So the next thing is we've got one more look back on a video that I wasn't happy with that's horror related. It's a versus, and we'll talk about both movies again. And then we've got a nice special week where all of next week is going to be devoted to a director, we'll say. So that's going to be what that is. And after that, we will continue with more original versus remake stuff and a big franchise review that's going to be a few videos and other stuff in between. So until the next thing, I think that's it.